On today's World Insight, a snag in diplomatic efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Can Tehran and Washington ever see eye to eye on sanctions relief and saving the 2015 agreement? And in today's interview series, Hong Kong Outlook, HKSR legal minds speak on what the future holds for the one country, two systems principle. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. The Iranian Foreign Ministry has rejected an EU offer for informal talks with the U.S. to salvage the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Iran insists on the U.S. lifting all unilateral sanctions first. Tehran also added that recent actions by Washington have deterred Iran's appetite for diplomacy. This is a nod to U.S. airstrikes on alleged Iranian-backed militia along the Syria-Iraq border. Further south, Biden has pushed for an end to the civil war in Yemen, showing a more assertive U.S. policy toward Iran's archrival Saudi Arabia. Biden has been in the Oval Office for almost a month. Does his Middle East policy break from that of his predecessor? Has he done much? Let's take a look at this. And I'm joined by a very strong panel in Tehran, Mohammad Morandi, professor at Tehran University. In Washington, D.C., Ivan Eland, senior fellow and director of the Center of Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. In Tampa, we have Mohsen Milani, who is the executive director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies and also professor of politics at the University of South Florida. He's also author of the book, The Making of Iran's Islamic Revolution. Last but not least, in Beijing, Zhou Rong, senior fellow of Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies from Renmin University of China. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Professor Morandi, what is your assessment of whether this new administration in the U.S. will be able to work on the Iran nuclear issue constructively?
Well, it remains to be seen. The Iranians are more than willing to give the Americans the opportunity to implement the nuclear deal. But of course, the Iranians won't accept any changes, any additions, any extensions, or linking the nuclear deal to some other regional or security issues. The deal was negotiated over years. Both sides made concessions. Iran was very flexible. Many in Iran believe that the negotiators were too flexible. Right or wrong, ultimately the Iranians agreed to their side of the bargain, and so did the Americans. And at that time, Biden was the vice president, so he was a part of the administration that made that decision. So the Iranians are saying that in order for the two sides to move forward, both sides have to implement the nuclear deal in full without preconditions. If Biden is willing to do that, if he's willing to put aside the sort of policies that we saw Trump try to impose, then we can move forward. Otherwise, if Biden wants to set preconditions, then he'll be doing the same thing as Trump, and he'll get nowhere, because the Iranians refused to appease Trump. They will definitely not appease Biden.
Okay. No free conditions. Mr. Eland, is that possible for the new administration? Your assessment?
Well, I think the two sides will probably eventually agree. We'll have to see, but I think both sides are suspicious of each other. So I don't think that there will be a full return on both sides of the agreement immediately. I think it will have to be a phased approach where one side does one thing, or they both do like a partial thing to start with, and then step by step, and perhaps they can get together in the end. I think both sides probably do want to to get together. I think the Iranians were slow to, go in violation of the agreement because they wanted to save it, and the Trump administration didn't really want to do that. But I think the Biden administration is much more attuned to that. So I think you'll probably see an agreement eventually. I'm not sure. I think the two sides will dance around. They may go to partial steps, as I said, but I think they'll eventually probably reach some sort of deal.
Mr. Milani, this is going to be a very important issue, the Iran nuclear deal, because that's what the new administration has chosen in terms of showing their strength of diplomacy and capability of diplomacy. Do you see signs that this time it will be done differently? How is the process now going toward a constructive solution?
Yes, I believe the Biden administration is very sincere about its desire to return to the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal. And I think Iran is also very sincere about its desire to implement its obligations under JCPOA. The problem is that the US wants Iran to implement its provision first and then lift the sanctions. So the question is a matter of sequencing. Who is going to make the first step? The Iranians don't trust the US because they think that the US withdrew from the nuclear deal unilaterally and imposed sanctions. And in their thinking, what guarantee is there that if Iran returns fully to implementation of the JCPOA, the US somehow doesn't find an excuse to reimpose sanctions? So there is considerable degree of mistrust between the two countries, but I agree with your guests that ultimately the two countries are going back to the negotiating table, and they will do everything they can to keep the JCPOA alive and well.
Mr. Milani, two things. First of all, trust. That's such a treasured word. And yet, we do not see even trust within the United States between the two parties and within one party, the different factions, as we have seen over the past few years. So whether trust is too much to ask between two negotiating partners. Mr. Milani, very briefly.
Absolutely right. There is mistrust on the part of the Iranian and mistrust on the part of the US. That's why we have a very vigorous system of verification. And countries in the world, when they sign an agreement, they usually do not base it on trust completely. They do it on verification.
Yes.
The fundamental problem is that when you do not trust the other side, you might not be willing to give the kind of concessions to begin the process. Right now, as I said, the question is who is going to make the first step. This is why the only way we can address this issue is to start a process where for every step the US makes, Iran can make a corresponding step. Do not forget, whether you're in favor of the nuclear deal or not, the fact of the matter is that it wasn't Iran who got out of the nuclear deal. It was the US who got out of it. And therefore, I don't think it would be inappropriate for the US to make some positive, to take some positive step to show that it is sincere and to build confidence. And then Iran, perhaps at the same time, make appropriate step to show that Iran is sincere about implementing its obligations under the JCPOA.
Okay. Mr. Eland, how much have you seen in that direction, that the U.S. making some steps to show it is sincere, at least to come back to the earlier already agreed upon framework, and now walk it back?
I think the Iranians were angry, or at least dismayed, that they didn't get much sanctions released even when they went to their nuclear, when they started, steps to suspend their nuclear program. even under Secretary Kerry, they were complaining about, the U.S. financial system, the U.S. Dominated world financial system wasn't, giving relief on sanctions. So I think the United States should probably start off by, making a significant, reduction in sanctions, and, arrange for Iran to make a significant, step toward re-entering the nuclear agreement. And I think that would build confidence on both sides.
Professor Morandi, what are the steps that Iran is expecting the deal to make? Secondly, how will Iran be able to judge the sincerity coming from the United States, and how will Iran show the sincerity to the United States as well?
Well, obviously for Iran, the United States has to make the first move because the United States left the deal. The United States imposed sanctions on Iran and created great harm to ordinary Iranians. People died as a result. So the United States is answerable, and the Iranians abided by their commitments. The International Atomic Energy Agency repeatedly verified the fact that the Iranians were fully committed. And until just a few days ago, the Iranians continued to abide by at least some of their commitments, including the implementation of the additional protocol. And Biden, during the last month, refused to reverse any of Trump's presidential decrees, which he could have done easily. If he had reversed Trump's presidential decrees, the Iranians would not have stopped implementing the additional protocol. So the Iranians do not see, so far, goodwill coming from Washington. The Americans have not only do they have the capability to reverse what Trump has done, but Biden has promised to do so. But we have two other things also as well. One is history, and that is that during the Obama administration, as your previous guest rightly pointed out, the United States didn't implement their side of the bargain. Let's forget Trump. Obama himself, and Biden, of course, was his vice president, refused to implement his side of the bargain. The Iranians were not allowed to use, under different excuses, the international financial system and apparatus was closed. Its doors were closed to Iran. And the reason was that behind the scenes, the United States Treasury Department was warning banks and other financial institutions not to work with Iran. And secondly, even as we speak, Biden has not abided by his own promises to the American people either. The minimum wage, this seems to be going out the window, or the fact that they were supposed to give Americans $2,000 checks, that's turned into $1,400 checks. So with that history and with what is happening now, the Iranians are saying, look, we didn't exit the agreement. We were the side that implemented the deal. You were the side that hurt the Iranians. You have to make the first step and verify it. And we, as we did in the past, we will do our side of the bargain.
Now let me go to Mr. Zhou. Of course, China is a party of the JCPOA at the time when that agreement came into being. So I want to approach the question a little bit different from the other three gentlemen, because they are mainly stakeholders of the two sides. So how much trust is there for the other parties of the JCPOA, China, the European Union, some of the others, toward the U.S. so-called coming back to the Iran nuclear deal? How much have you observed so far, Mr. Zhou?
I think the difference between European and the Chinese are quite clear. Number one, we have the common ground, that is both G3 and China and Russia want America to come back to the Iran nuclear treaty. That is the same. We have the similar opinions. But difference is, who should just make a concession first? Iran should make concession first, or American? From China and Russia's point of view, that's America. It is American who first violates the law and who first withdraw from the treaty. So America should just show more sincere step. I'm not saying that American can abandon all the sanctions against Iran suddenly, immediately, and completely. But I'm saying that Americans should just make concession first and show enough seniority towards Iran. But right now, Americans only do some symbolic work, such as lift some restriction of Iranian diplomats, activities in New York or in some other places. But that's not enough. What Iranian need is Iranian people just is suffering pandemic of COVID-19. They need medicine, and they also need oil export. They also need to use American dollars financial institute to relax their economic crisis. But America has nothing to do and has done nothing for that. So from Chinese point of view and the Russian point of view, we need and hope America can make concession first to just show they really want to have for future cooperation with Iran, really wanted to sincerely join back to the nuclear treaty.
Let me go to Professor Morandi. Question really is for the complicated U.S. Politics. 2 years from now, midterm election, nobody knows whether Biden will really be able to, with his administration, implement his words.
Well, that is a major issue, isn't it? But it's even worse than that. Not only is it unclear what will happen in the future, because we don't know what will happen in 2 years' time, and we won't know what happens in 4 years' time. But in any case, for the Iranians, what is important is the implementation of the deal as we speak. And the United States doesn't have a good track record. The Iranians do have a good track record. The Iranians implemented the deal in full from day one. In fact, one of the criticisms of the current administration in Iran was that they implemented their side of the deal immediately after it was signed and then waited for the Americans to implement. And the Americans never did that. The Obama administration only implemented bits and pieces. And until the very last day of the Obama administration, the United States was not abiding by much of its commitments, whereas the Iranians throughout that period of time were. And of course, everything went downhill under Trump. So now what the Iranians are saying is that, 2 years down the road, that's another problem. 4 years down the road, that's even a bigger question. But right now, what we haven't seen on the American side of the table is movement towards implementation. Whereas until, just as I said, just a few days ago, Iran was still implementing the additional protocol. The Americans could have, by reversing Biden himself, just by a signature, he could have reversed Trump's presidential decrees and thus allowed the Iranian administration to continue implementing the additional protocol, because the Iranian parliament passed a law which said that unless the Americans abide by their commitments, then the Iranian administration can no longer continue implementing the additional protocol, because the logic in Iran is that we cannot continue just going on implementing parts of the deal when the other side is implementing nothing. Because when we do implement parts of the deal, that decreases the other side's, that decreases the will on the other side to fulfill their side of the bargain.
Point taken. Mr. Eland, I know you are not representing the current administration, of course not, of the previous administration, but you're from the U.S. U.S. academic circle. So it seems that, Mr. Eland, if I get it right, it's not the issue of trust, really. It's the issue of basic credibility the U.S. has.
Yes, well, honestly, I think Trump has damaged that in this particular issue by withdrawing from the treaty. I understand that Iran, I think, has a legitimate point there. I would say that, in a democracy, we have two different parties and they disagree on a lot of things. And I also wouldn't confuse the domestic scene, the $2,000 versus the $1,400 checks or the minimum wage. That involves the two parties. This involves foreign affairs, and traditionally the president has more leeway in foreign affairs than he does on domestic issues. He does not have to negotiate as much with the other party. Particularly in this case, the U.S. was a party, and the president, Trump at the time, withdrew from this agreement. Biden can go back into it. And actually, the 2-year and 4-year uncertainty might benefit this, because he may have an incentive, despite, I think, his initial maneuvering, I think, to because he doesn't trust Iran all the way, and also because it's a negotiation. So I think he wants to maximize initial position. But I think he has an incentive to reach an agreement before 2 years and get back into it, either get back into this one, or if they wanted to make it over an extended period of time, he has an incentive to do that, because he does have razor thin majorities, both the Senate and the House, the two houses of Congress. And so therefore, and the president's party who's in power usually loses seats in the midterm elections in 2 years. So he may have an incentive to wrap this up before that happens, or even before next year when the campaign is on.
Interesting. Mr. Zhou, of course, you're observing from afar, but how do you see the overall changes of the Middle East situation at the very beginning of the Biden term, and its impact likely to have on the Iran nuclear deal?
Yes, I really noticed that this Saudi Arabia right now is partially sanctioned by the United States. But we should say that both countries, I mean, USA and Saudi Arabia, are allies as well as their strategic partners. So it is very difficult to predict that's the future relationship between the two. But anyway, they are still allies, and America and Israel still allies. So I suppose if we all remember that the Nixon's visit of China, I think it's 1972. So is it possible that in the future that the Iran leader, I mean President Rouhani, or maybe the next one after him, and Biden can meet in Tehran or in the third country such as Baghdad, I mean Iraq, and to just to move the very courageable step and to just smooth the relationship between the two. Anyway, I'm quite positive for the future normalization relationship between Iran and America. But right now, the key issues who should make a concession first. Iran also should watch the Americans' current government's different attitude towards Israel and Saudi Arabia. As just now, one of the professors from America said, to just use of this very good window opportunity to do something more. Yes, the principle maybe you should keep, but also should show more flexibility toward the current government